All right, good morning, everybody. This going. Hope everybody had a good evening and back for day two. Just as a preview for today, and it's where we left off yesterday. So we're going to talk a little bit more specifically about some of the fiscal rules, including allowable costs, some of the real fun details of supplement, not supplant, and maintenance of effort, which everybody always enjoys. But actually, one thing that I was thinking of, this is many of these rules, most of these rules, all of these rules in one form or another apply to all federal programs. So many of you raised your hand that you administer more than just Title I Part D. So these will be relevant to that. And I'll make sure to point out also where there are some differences. And so hopefully you'll find this useful for kind of the full range of your jobs. And the South Carolina Department of Education has some really high quality materials on allowable costs. So we're going to get a chance to work with those. And then in the afternoon today, you're going to get a chance in planning with Ann, you're going to get a chance to dig into your application and get yourselves all prepared so that when it opens in GEMS, you're going to be all ready to go with an application and also some tools to evaluate that application. So not just the application, but knowing that it's of high quality and meets all the fiscal rules, all the programmatic rules, and we'll be all ready to go. So I think we'll have a good day today. Do want to start with a parking lot of any questions or any unresolved issues from yesterday. And so that was the assignment, your homework assignment, which I'm willing to take them in a moment. But I did get one at the end of the day yesterday, which I wanted to address first, which is a really essential topic. It's a topic that I hear all around the country in states and school districts, and actually in other industries as well, but it's the issue of staffing. And somebody brought up the issue that the challenge with program is finding qualified staff who are essentially willing to work, and just that hiring people is a challenge in this environment. We hear it over and over and over again, and funding is limited, and so outside and starting salaries sometimes are extremely low in communities, and there are other opportunities for folks. So this is a challenge. I know one of the answers is there any way that you can find more funds to increase salaries or bonuses? Different districts have done a variety of things, but there are some real challenges with staffing. And so wanted to open it up to the group and see if anybody had any ideas or creative ways that they are staffing. And staffing here means teaching positions, but also other staff support positions and other positions in a district. Anybody have any creative ideas? Even just want to commiserate with folks who are dealing with those challenges?
I don't. I can't.
And we're gonna talk a little bit with reasonable costs. But yeah, one of the reasonable costs is, what are the prevailing rates? And the prevailing rates are a fluid. There's not like a set, there's not a set amount that it is. And if you want tutors, especially if they're high quality, and there are some tools that you can use, especially if you have folks who have connections with your students and have a demonstrated track record of success. If you can find money, and I know money is not always there, but yes, if you can find money to increase the pay for those folks, that's a strategy because it's a challenge. And there is again, we're going to go into allowable costs. There is a lot of research that shows even doubling the pay for tutors may be less expensive than having to hire new tutors because of all the costs associated with human resources and training and all of those costs. And I actually I think that in the for-profit world, they do a better job of assigning the cost of losing personnel rather than retaining personnel. And I don't think that our calculations are always done sort of the most way that supports the work that we do, because retaining teachers can save money. Even if you think, well, why am I paying $5,000 more for this tutor? Okay, well, it would have cost $7,500 to replace the tutor. So don't think of it as spending $5,000. Think of it as saving $2,500. And even that flip in mentality when talking to a school board or a school administrator can make a difference. And if you can find, now I also know that budgets are not unlimited, but you can find some data that supports that the importance of retaining folks once you have them. And the reality is, in this job market virtually everywhere, people have other opportunities, and they're not joking when they say, look, I could go to this place and make this money, so what can you do for me? That's a real thing in today's job market. So I think that's a really good point, one way to think about it. There are some states that have, I know Texas has embarked on a program, and I can send some information to Ann to share out, but Texas has embarked on a program of bonuses for teachers, and it's a statewide program in certain schools and trying to attract and retain teachers. I'm not exactly sure where they came up with all of the funds. I think some of them might have been federal stimulus funds that the state decided to redirect that way. Again, I'm not totally sure where they're paying for it, but that's something that then, because the other challenge that you get into, and I've had this in Wisconsin, is if you don't want districts to necessarily compete with each other for the same small, limited number of folks who are willing to work, in that, okay, you might be successful in your district, but if you're taking people out of another district, the system as a whole is not necessarily better off for that. So I think that's one of the reasons behind Texas's approach. Is they said, look, we don't want districts finding their staff by hiring staff out of another district, thereby creating a deficit. And oftentimes it's the students most in need who then get hurt in that scenario. And so if we can approach this statewide, we can level the playing field a little bit. So that's something which, again, is a challenge. These are not easy answers. And I know the person, I don't expect that anybody thought any easy answers, but there are some potential things you can do. Any other ideas? Let me pause for a moment. It'll come as we go. We'll try to get it going. But well, we'll think about that. If there's anything else that comes up, we'll have a couple of other opportunities in the day. But so that staffing, that's a critical issue. Yeah, actually, and I'll touch on some of the parts of it a little bit as we go through allowable costs and reasonable and necessary, which is going to be one of our first topics. But any other unresolved issues, or like I said, anything is on your way home, you're like, wait, what did he say about that? What did he mean by that? I don't quite get that thing. Anything that jumped out overnight? Okay, again, if coffee comes in and it kicks in later this morning, I will be here and ready to go. But we will go ahead. We're going to move on to some of the fiscal rules, which will definitely provide caffeine in and of itself. The fiscal rules, and here I'm talking about ESEA fiscal rules. I did not ask yesterday. Just curious, from a show of hands, how many of you also coordinate IDEA, special education services, in your district? Not many, which is also fairly often that's separate. Some of these rules apply to IDEA programs as well, but some of them are more specific to ESEA fiscal rules. Tying back to what we talked about yesterday, ESEA fiscal rules are covered under a set of federal regulations called the Uniform Grant Guidance. And so Uniform Grant Guidance, actually in this case, it does apply to IDEA because it's uniform grant, meaning this applies to all federal grants. And so these are regulations which, again, they hold the power of law. So these regulations must be followed. There's a link to them, and the South Carolina Department of Education references them on their website and multiple places, which will kind of share a little bit. But if you are interested, you can see Code of Federal Regulations. This is an official .gov website, so this is part of the government. And I don't know why I linked it to subpart E, but part 200 is the uniform grant guidance, and there's a whole host of different elements in the uniform grant guidance that you can go through. There's trainings you can go through. We're gonna touch on kind of some of the key elements of the we're going to touch on some of the key elements of the uniform guidance and set you up so not go too into the weeds on the technical side. One of the things that I really recommend, if you are not the business manager in your district, often to sit with the business manager in your district as you're preparing your budget, so that you can kind of be on the program side of it and your business manager can cover the fiscal side of it, and having 2 people or larger than 2 people, but a team of people so that everybody has their expertise, I think is a really wise way to approach budgeting and programmatic decisions. This comes from South Carolina Department of Ed, and we're going to look at this in a little bit, but they have a document, a guidance document. It's really helpful on allowable uses of funds for all of the ESEA titles, and it has some specific examples. It's referenced it's linked on the materials page, and if you're not familiar with it, again, I highly recommend it. We're going to pull out some examples for it, because if you cover more than one federal program, then it gives you examples for these multiple federal programs. So a really good idea. And this is kind of the list of criteria that federal applications must meet. And we're going to go through them in different levels of detail, starting with necessary and reasonable, going to applicable, and then some at the end. I don't think these bullets, they're not really all separate. Some of them build on each other, and you can kind of see as you go through if you're meeting especially towards the top of them, if you're meeting necessary and reasonable, applicable, and conform to EDGAR, which is the Education Department General Administrative Regulations, then you've mostly covered the rest of them, because they're going to all be in alignment. So you're going to see they build on each other, and it's not each of these separate bullet points. We need a lot more coffee to get through each of these separate bullet points. But I want to start out with necessary and reasonable, because reasonable is one of, in the fiscal world, probably one of the fun elements to cover in thinking about what does it mean to be reasonable. And so this, again, this language here is from federal regulations, so it has the power and weight of law. And it says a cost is reasonable if, in its nature and amount, it does not exceed that which would be incurred by a prudent person under the circumstances prevailing at the time the decision was made to incur the cost. So the prudent person standard. And there's not a singular example of what or who this prudent person is. I'm going to give you a couple of guidelines that I look towards. I think prudent can mean different things, and it's also it can change over time and under circumstances. As you say, it says here, under the circumstances prevailing at the time the decision was made, what a prudent person would do. I don't know if some of you work. I had a colleague and her husband worked in construction, and the prudent person, she and her husband, if they were driving on a road trip, would stop for snacks. And she brought this up as an example, that what would be considered what she considered a snack to get on a road trip might be different than her husband, who worked in construction, who might eat an entire pizza as part of his snack for construction, where she grabbed a small thing of peanuts to get her through. And so they both might be prudent within their circumstances, but they are different. I was thinking of an example. I don't know if anybody's been to national conferences. One of the great authorities nationally is Tiffany Kessler from Brewman, does workshops on this. I don't know if you ever heard her. She has better examples than I can ever give. But I was thinking of one of the prudent questions she has a lot of pop culture references. So this one might not quite fly, but I'm going to try it a little bit. Taylor Swift concert tickets, which are, and she's, extended her tour. And the cost of some of those concert tickets, hundreds of dollars, if not thousands of dollars. Is that a prudent person to pay that money for a concert? I guess I don't know. But then if you look at a stadium and has 110,000 people in it, somebody might be able to make the argument, well, there's a lot of people there, and just sort of the weight of all of those people, millions and millions, hundreds of millions of concerts tickets worldwide, collectively means that is a prudent decision. Now, to be really clear, that is not with your federal funds. Entertainment is one of the not allowable activities. So please, no Taylor Swift tickets with your federal funds. Because actually that leads into some of the ways that I like to think about the prudent person test has to do with, if you saw this expenditure on the front page of the newspaper, would you be comfortable with it? How would you feel in your community if this gets reported on the front page of the newspaper? I think sometimes that's a good substitute for the prudent person test. It's like, like thinking of meals sometimes, and food costs are always challenging with what you can spend and light snacks and things like that. But even with food, if you're saying, look, we had students and we were taking a field trip and they were gone for 10 hours to visit colleges. It was a college tour and we needed to feed these students, and we got them sandwiches from Subway for, we spent $30 for sandwiches of Subway. If that was on the front page of the newspaper, would you be comfortable with defending that and be okay with that? And I think in most communities you say, yes, we took these students on a college tour. We feel comfortable defending that. Prudent person can understand that. The same trip, if you stopped at, I don't know the example of a restaurant, but if you spent $350 for 5 students on dinner, with multiple courses and desserts, and spent hundreds of dollars, and that got into the newspaper, would you be comfortable with that one? I think you'd be a lot less comfortable with that type of answer. So I think the prudent person, I like to use the front page of the newspaper test sometimes. I've had to do this sometimes with superintendents, or superintendents sometimes are attuned to that, because you can be in a situation where, I was actually talking with somebody earlier, somebody higher up you says, oh, can't we just use Title I or Title I Part D money to spend on this? And sometimes that front page of the newspaper, if this gets out on the newspaper, are you comfortable with the way this looks in your district? Sometimes that can be a good defense and can kind of clarify that prudent person test into something that might help you, in some cases, help you explain why that is not what a prudent person can do, because you don't want to say that, you don't necessarily want to say, well, you might not be a prudent person, but think, is this something that you are willing to defend? And if it's something you're willing to defend because you're feeding kids who are out of, like on a college tour, that makes a lot of sense, but being prudent about that. Continue with the examples, but any questions about that or comments? Because I know this often there's a lot of caveats that go along with the reasonable side. Okay, continuing on with reasonable, and again, this is in the same federal regulations here. So whether the cost is generally recognized as ordinary, and here reasonable and necessary get put together, but is it an ordinary cost? And that's one, if you've been doing something for a while, it tends to be ordinary. In education, costs of teachers and tutors and instructional materials, those types of things are ordinary costs. It's when you get into other types of costs that sometimes get questionable. You have in B, sound business practices, arm's length bargaining. I'm going to actually go into that one in a second. C, I wanted to talk about for a second, market prices for comparable goods or services for the geographic area. Just want to talk about this one for a second and connect with the prudent person test in a second, that there are differences in market prices in geographic areas. And so I don't know if South Carolina has this. The federal government puts out, many states adopt, the federal government puts out a list of hotel costs in geographic regions, so that if you're traveling on government business, there are certain prices you can pay for hotels in different regions, and they vary by region. So a hotel room in New York City, you have a higher threshold for what you can spend on that hotel than a hotel in Shreveport, Louisiana, or Columbia, South Carolina. And so even within the state of South Carolina, so I don't know if South Carolina has the same thing at the government, many school districts have that, and it's going to depend on the geographic area. And so hope my South Carolina geography will be okay. But if you're going to Myrtle Beach, especially Myrtle Beach in spring break time, the hotel costs might be more expensive than a different part of the state. And so it might be allowable under the reasonableness that, okay, we understand why hotel costs are more expensive in Myrtle Beach in March or April. However, going back to the prudent person, somebody might say, why would you schedule this? Why are you going to schedule this event in Myrtle Beach in March or April, knowing that those costs are going to be higher and it's going to be double what a hotel would cost somewhere else in the state in that same time period? And so these things, you need to build them together. And again, that's one on the newspaper test. If it comes out, well, why did you schedule this conference there? You don't necessarily want to be in a position of having to defend that if you're not comfortable with defending it. So it is okay to have higher costs in different regions, and there might be higher costs in Myrtle Beach at any time of the year than other parts of the state, but you don't necessarily want to have to defend why you're doing that when you could have done it at a different time of the year or in a different region at the same time of year. Couple of things here. Whether the individuals concerned acted with prudence. One of the things that with reasonable costs also have to do with, are there any, and this is in a couple of different places, but are there any conflicts of interest that come up? Does the person who are purchasing these costs have any personal or family connections with who is providing the services? And I think, conflict of interest can be, there are some cases in education where it certainly can be understandable. There's a lot of folks in education whose families, their spouses are also in education. And so it's not an automatic disqualification, but disclosing that information becomes really important, and being clear about what those conflicts are so that everybody understands what those conflicts are can be really important here. And that leads into part E here of, do you have established procedures, for example, conflict of interest policies that you're following? And if you override those policies, like if you have a policy that you have to disclose in a contract if there are any family connections. And then I unfortunately had a case in Wisconsin where the superintendent had such a policy in their district and then hired his wife and just ignored that part. He didn't disclose to the school board that he was hiring his wife, because did it through an LLC, which didn't have his wife's name on it. And it was one where, and she was a qualified individual. So this might have been a case where if the superintendent had followed the policies, everything might have been okay with it. But again, and this one unfortunately did make the newspaper. And in that newspaper test, it did not look good when the superintendent didn't follow the policies and then had the appearance of a conflict of interest. And the school board raised the question of, well, why did you not disclose this? And it looked like they kind of created an LLC that did not follow the policy. So you want to be really careful about that and make sure that you follow policies. It's one of the things the audit team looks for, not just what are your policies, but give me evidence that you're following those policies, and so that we can see that as you're going through. All right, I'm going to go to the necessary part of necessary and reasonable in a second, but first let me pause and see if we have any questions about any of the reasonable regulations. And there are often at conferences, you can have examples of auditors like to bring up cases where reasonable isn't followed, and there are some, unfortunately, both dramatic and cases where reasonable isn't followed, and it does cost people, have to pay back funds and other types of penalties that get incurred. So it is something that you want to follow for best practices and to support the students, as we talked about. But let me pause. Any questions about reasonable or comments? Okay, necessary, the necessary part of reasonable. What does it mean? What does it mean to be necessary for the performance of the federal award? Well, here when we talk about necessary, we're going to tie back to what we started with yesterday, which is necessary for what? To carry out the purpose of the title. Is this cost necessary to meet the purposes of the title, the goals and the purpose of the title, the goals and objectives in South Carolina's state plan? Are your costs, can you make a clear case? This is one of the things about the newspaper kind of criteria. Can you make a clear case? This is why we needed this cost in order to carry out the purpose of the title and to meet the goals in our plan. We needed to hire additional tutors, or we needed additional mental health support for our Title I Part D students, because coming out of COVID, our data showed that our needs assessment showed our students were really struggling with mental health issues. They needed this. Therefore, we needed to add to our mental health supports as a school, as an institution, so that we could best support these students, so that they would be prepared for transition back to their home communities. They would be prepared for post-secondary and all of those different parts of the objectives that we talked about. So necessary and reasonable for what? To carry out the purpose of the title. And I just reminded you in here what those purposes are, and that's why I really believe it's so fundamentally important to ground in the purpose, not just for the programmatic side, but also for the fiscal side. And I think, again, here's why I think it's really essential that program folks sit with fiscal folks, because the fiscal folks might just look at a cost, and the cost without the purpose of the program is, I mean, it's almost like an empty shell. It's not necessary for anything. It has to be necessary in order to do X, Y, and Z. And that's where you want to ground yourself in the cost. And again, we're going to see some examples in a little bit of examples of allowable costs. Those are ones which are generally considered things that come under, that do align with the purpose and carry out the purpose and intent and meet the goals of South Carolina's state plan. And South Carolina does a really good job of highlighting this. They even bold it. I'm going to show you in a moment. They say this is not an exhaustive list. These are not the only things. These are not the only allowable costs, because in your unique circumstances, you might have something that is an allowable cost that is not necessarily on this list, but you can do it because it's necessary to carry out the purpose of the title. And we went through these yesterday, so I don't need to do them again, but I like to ground both the fiscal side and the programmatic side together with the purpose of Title I Part D. And so remember, and this is the subpart 2 purpose. Remember, that has the additional subpart, and all of these go together, and you have the one sheet which has all of the purposes on it. All right, again, let me pause here with necessary and reasonable and see if we have any questions or comments, or even just stories about necessary and reasonable. And again, necessary and reasonable. Now, obviously, the purposes are different, but necessary and reasonable is not just a Title I Part D. That is for all of your programs. And I will admit, I don't know South Carolina state law or fiscal rules. Some of my friends from South Carolina Department of Education do. Even if it's not explicitly written into South Carolina generally accepted accounting practices, a necessary and reasonable standard, if you follow that, you're always going to be on pretty safe ground, in that if you say you want to root your costs in what is necessary and what is reasonable. So I wanted to spend a little bit of time on that one. I now want to go, we're going to talk a little bit more about some of the other elements of the fiscal rules. We're going to talk about, actually, I want to talk about allocable. And in allocable, I'm going to actually go to the South Carolina Allowable Use of Funds Guidance document. There is a I have this up here. This is dated May of 2023, so kudos to the team. I knew it just came out recently, couldn't remember the date, May of 2023. I don't know how many folks, this is linked in here. I don't know how many folks have been through this in detail so far, but this covers, I'm gonna come back to this. I wanted to go to the allocable costs, but sorry, you can look away. I don't want to give anybody a headache scrolling here, but it's a great document in that it has contents for, you can see Title I Part A, Title I Part D, Title II Part A, Title III Part A, Title III Part A, Title III Immigrant Youth, Title IV Part A, Title V REAP. And so it has all of these with cost reference and examples. And so if you manage more than one federal program, if you don't have this document either bookmarked or printed and have a copy with it, I highly recommend it because it's going to root you in what you need. It also goes through, like I said, it starts with allowable uses of funds and necessary and reasonable. So you have the same language which I just shared about reasonable costs, allowable costs, and then did I just pass allocable? So allocable, and don't want to go too far into this, but spend a little bit of time here. A cost is allocable to a particular federal award if the goods or services involved are chargeable or assignable to that federal award or cost objective. When they're talking about cost objectives here, that again ties to the purpose of the program. So is this cost something that you need for the purpose of the funding? And so it's why I said all of these things kind of feed on each other and they're in a cycle, and you can kind of use them as examples. And if you're following, I don't want to say if you're following one, you're automatically following all of the others, but they definitely work together in that way. Number two, I do want to talk about for a second here, which is it benefits both the federal award and other work of the non-federal entity and can be distributed in proportions that may be approximated using reasonable methods. So this is something that's important in allocable funds, is what percentage of the person is assignable to each federal award. So for example, you might hire a teacher who is doing 50% of their work with, or let's say it's a counselor, and 50% of their assignment is working with Title I Part D students and focusing on those transition costs that we talked about. And 50% of their job, it's a full-time person, but 50% of their job is working in a school with other students, not having anything to do with N&D, might even be paying with them with local funds. You can divide those separately. So those are two separate, the allocable costs for the Title I Part D grant would only be the 50% that they're working with students. And you want to maintain records that you're very clear, that's right here. You want to have records here which are very clear that can show that these are the activities for Title I Part D and these are the non-Title I Part D, and keep those separate so that you can involve that. And we're going to talk in a little bit about supplement, not supplant. And somebody says, well, if that person's serving both Title I Part D and non-Title I Part D, is there a potential for supplement, not supplant? Not if you're being very clear about this. In a sense, you know, the way that I like to think about it, it's one job, but you're almost breaking it into two separate jobs is a good way to think about it. And then you're not supplanting. Where you get into trouble is if you are paying a full-time person for Title I Part D, and then the auditors come in and they say, okay, you know, we want to see maybe not personally identifiable information, but we want to see which Title I Part D students are they working with. Oh, they only work with Title I Part D students for these 3 periods. The other 3 periods, they're working with the general population. That then, now you've crossed over and those costs are not allocable, and that's when you run into trouble of having to back them out. So you want to keep those costs, those allocable costs mean the part of the cost that is under this activity, you want to keep separate from the part of the cost that is not under this activity. And there's also, I was talking with Sarah before, you get into some of the more detailed cost allocation principles, which I said yesterday, I am not an attorney, not trained as an attorney. I'm also not an accountant. I'm not certified public accountant. So some of these also get a little bit, I had to sit with accountants when I was going through this. So again, pairing your program side with your business side, with your accounting side is a really strong way to make sure that you're covering both of these, because sometimes the accounting people will say, well, okay, I can see that this is, you're paying prevailing rate wage, for example. I can kind of understand that and do the math on that, but I don't know, is this a necessary program cost? The accounting person might not have the education background to say, okay, yes, you need this type of program, or you need a computer program or something like that as a way to align. So you have those different types of things. Let me go into that. So, oops, sorry, went to the wrong. Examples of allowable costs, and you have a handout. Everybody got this handout yesterday. This is also published. This is from page 11. I'm going to show this in a second, of the allowable use of funds guidance. There's actually, South Carolina Department of Education is doing, they're doing tremendous work in giving you these types of resources, because they have a list of allowable costs or examples of allowable activities and expenditures in both the general document, which I showed you, and in the Title I Part D handbook. They have essentially the same information, but it gives you some examples here. And I'm going to show those in a second. I wanted to also appreciate Anne put out handwritten. I don't know if you did it once and copied them, or actually had to handwrite them on all of them, Anne, so kudos to you. But you see furniture is added here on the right-hand side under non-allowable activities. That has come up, and NDTAC just recently, and I say recently in the last, looking at Anne, month or so, put out some guidance saying that in general, furniture is not allowed as a cost because it is an assumed cost. Like chairs and desks are assumed as a basic education cost. And if you're educating students in a room, you need to have a place for them to sit. And so chairs and desks would not be a specific Title I Part D cost. Now, there may be some types of furniture. If a program says we need specialized furniture to meet the specific needs of our students, let's say some furniture that support, well, with IDEA, this is something that often comes up in IDEA, that there's specialized furniture that meets the IEP needs of a student, and that would be allowable, because if you think of it, and we're going to talk, again, we'll talk about supplement, not supplant, but it is on top of. So a student has a desk and a chair assigned to him or her, but needs additional types of support from furniture so that they can fully access the curriculum. In that type of case, a specialized furniture would be allowed. And there might be some circumstances, I am not familiar with all of the furniture or environment around mental health support and trauma-informed care, but there might be a case where somebody makes the determination of why that would be necessary. Again, you might need to go back to the reasonable and necessary standard. I had an example. Now, this was Title I Part A, not Title I Part D. I had a district which contacted me that wanted to put in a special kind of lighting in their classrooms. And this lighting was going to simulate natural light. And they actually sent me evidence. It was a very expensive project. I don't remember exactly what it was, but they wanted to do it in the entire building. So it was like hundreds of thousands of dollars, and it was going to simulate natural light. and I asked, what was the research behind this? And they sent me research on how this would promote learning. All of the research was published by the lighting company. And so we then applied, I talked with the team about it, we then applied the prudent person and the front page of the newspaper standard and said, I don't want this as the Wisconsin Department of Public Instruction approved this $250,000 expenditure for natural light inside a building, yes, with no independent research. So kind of putting those all together is what gets you at the allowable costs and how you want to think about those types of things. Yes.
But Pam doesn't mind. I want to share an example. She's really good at calling asking. But she had one of the facilities, facility that that was like that. So that's sort of an unusual request, I think. But their rationale was they needed that to transport students to different places.
But even now, there are some cases when you get to large expenditures like that. We've had some, and again, more Title I, this was Title I Part A, but rural community and needed or put in to buy a van so that they could well, it's actually one that came up in Esther and was talking about this yesterday, to bring meals out to students, or repurposing paying for school buses to now transport meals to students during COVID. And so, I started at the beginning and said the prudent person test can change over time. And at the beginning of COVID, there were some expenditures which I think a lot of folks would not have previously approved or even thought of, which became much more allowable in the beginning of COVID, including those reasonable costs. If you remember back to that, how much the cost of devices, iPads or devices, the cost went up, and districts were like, look, we know that last year we only paid $175 for these. Our suppliers now saying these are $350, and that's the bare bones price. And what are we supposed to do about it? And that was just supply chains. There was not much you could do about it at that time. Same thing with hotspots. And so those prudent persons can change over time, but you want to ask that. The same thing with the car is, how much of the time is this car going to be used for transporting? And in the prudent person, is that a better use of your funds than paying taxi service when you need it, or school bus service or something like that? Those are the types of questions that you can ask. And I know from working with Ann and the South Carolina Department of Education, they take these questions back and a lot of times do them in group discussion, because you want to kind of think about, look at what the guidance says, and then think about those prudent person types of decisions to see, are these reasonable? Is what's being asked of us reasonable, and does this make sense for us? I want to go and share. So these are some of the examples, and you've seen this. This way that this list is done is from the Title I Part D handbook. I think it's all of the same content as in the allowable use of funds guidance, except it doesn't have it doesn't have the non-allowable uses of funds in this. So again, SCDE, kudos to putting this out. But I did want to show, I just want to kind of highlight it for a moment here, that in the allowable use of funds guidance, this is the sentence that I really appreciated in bold here. I'm usually good at my acronyms, but I'm going to need some friends for OFSA acronym. Office of, I thought it was federal and state. I couldn't get the A. Thank you. Office of Federal and State Accountability does not publish an exhaustive list of allowable costs. However, the Allowable Use of Funds Guidance for Elementary and Secondary Education Act programs is provided to LEAs to assist in their planning. So this is planning purposes. This does not mean that these are the only things that are allowable, but it gives you some good guidance. And again, if you start to ask some of those questions, can kind of sort through and go through. And again, it gives you Title I Part A, and then Title I Part A and all of the different things. And actually also appreciate this. Under allowable activities, the LEAs must determine the homeless and neglected and delinquent set-asides based on its total allocation prior to any other allowable expenditure or transfers of funds. So that's actually what you have to do first. And it obviously relates to Title I Part D, but you have a lot of different examples here. Many of these examples, you're going to see the same bullet points, the same allowable costs under different programs, but other parts are not going to be. They might be more unique to one of the federal programs and not so much in the others. So which program you're under makes a difference. Just go down, I think it's page 11 for this one. Yep, because that's what, and this is the handout that you have of the Title I Part D. So between this one, cash awards, gift cards, entertainment, advertising a product or brand, we had some, including the school. You want to be careful about those types of advertising things are questionable. Field trips which have no clear ties to classroom instruction. Celebratory field trips, I understand the needs to them. You want to go to the amusement park at the end of the year. I know that that's a fun field trip, but if it's not tied to instructional purposes, you want to stay away from those. Anybody have any questions or comments about this list here? And again, this is the handout that you have without, I don't have the typed in furniture on here, but any questions about any of these or comments, discussion? The question was food items, let's say snacks for an after school program, could that be an allowable expense?
The answer to that is to work with your USDA and get those snacks there, obviously. But if you're not doing that and you can find really good cost-saving snacks elsewhere, that's allowable too. We're not talking about going out and spending $8 per kid for snacks. Okay, so keep all of that in mind.
I just want to clarify that food item was under the unallowable now. I just want to make sure.
So yeah, when we're talking about, you're extending the day for these kids, so you want to provide them with something.
Right. And if they're, I think, again, kind of tying it back to some of the earlier conversations, yes, if you have students, high school students who are now staying from, if your tutoring program is another 2.5 hours and they're there until 5 p.m. to have some nutritious food. I think, Jewel had said which I agree with, how much the cost is also the quality of the food. And so, giving them sort of junk food that's not going to help versus some, and I know I have a teenager, I know how that goes, but giving some fruits, vegetables, something that's going to be a little bit more sustainable, trail mix, something that's going to give them a little bit more brain food. Again, when you think about the front page of the newspaper, do you want, so-and-so high school was bringing in a catered meal for their after school program. That's not going to sound as good as, they gave apples and grapes and nuts for the after school program. Yeah, that's more, I'm not going to worry about that being on the front page. I'm going to be supportive. Yes, these are 16, 17-year-olds. They needed some nutrition. So I think that's in there. It does get, and you have here, including working lunches, which I think implies U.S. government and state governments are really sensitive as we're here, not refreshments for adults and professional learning, as we can see. And there's sometimes challenges with that, and that doesn't always sit right. I think it's there are definitely places where public sector work and private sector work are different, and this would be one of those cases where private sector has a lot more, freedom to do things like this. But so again, Jewel, I don't want to read into South Carolina's thing here, but some of this food and refreshments, including working lunches, is also to be wary of things like, oh yeah, we're doing professional learning, and so we're going to have a catered breakfast. Now, if there's a local community who wants to sponsor that and pay for that independently, that's fine. But using federal funds for it, again, looking at you, that's a red flag and a no-no. But thanks for that question. Any other questions here about the questions or comments about the allowable activities? One more comment that I haven't talked to somebody about this yesterday, but I think that it's a good example, is that these allowable activities, this list of allowable activities, can also pair up together. So for example, you have parent-family engagement on here and transportation on here. Those two can be paired together so that if you are planning family engagement activities, let's say a reading night, it's academically focused, reading night, math night, science night, something like that, and you have families in this case of N&D students, or same thing could apply for Title I Part A students who are not able to they have barriers and they're not able to get to the schools for this academic site, you can use your title costs to support transportation for the purposes of family engagement so that they can go together in that case. Now, they can also go together in terms of the non-allowable. So transportation for entertainment, if you're having a school dance and you're saying, oh, we're going to pay transportation for school dance activities, that one I would be a lot for families to come and watch the school dance. I'd be a lot less likely on that. You might be able to convince me of some of that in terms of chaperoning, but that one I'd be a lot more hesitant about. But you want to, especially with families in Title I Part D, students experiencing homelessness also has broader types of allowability under transportation and transportation for families. But if we know that family engagement makes a difference, and if the students are doing some type of showcase of their final senior projects or something like that, and the families can't physically get to the location where that is, would transportation costs be allowable there? Absolutely, that would be something you consider. So just thinking that these things can also go together. Also transportation in terms of extended day, year, or summer services. So if you're having that after school program and you have buses, but there's no buses, the buses stop running at 5 o'clock and you need to have extra buses to get them home at 5:30 because they're staying for that, that's something else that you can consider. So these elements kind of build upon each other. Questions about that? Comments? Anything jump out? Oh, I went back to this. Yes.
Yeah, about counseling, social emotional justice, counseling. Where's the line there? Because a lot of times these students, their families can't get them to those outside community services that they need. Where's the line there as far as providing transportation?
That's a good question. I think that you could write it into the plan easily, say that, these are services that your students need, but the parents aren't able to provide that transportation, that we could work that into the plan. I've not ever seen it in the plan, but I'm not saying it couldn't be.
And I've never really thought about it until just now, but we are having so much trouble with, we don't have public transportation available where we live.
I think that's Is that a regular thing people have trouble with? Is that?
Transportation? Yeah, the question, can use the microphone, but is transportation, especially for mental health services and counseling, an issue in terms of, you might even have a provider, but the families can't get the students to the provider, and if the provider is not in the school. And so could transportation potentially be an allowable expenditure in here? And so question, are other folks seeing that? And in some communities, including rural communities, there is no public transportation option, no buses. And so is that something that could potentially be an option? You know,
But, obviously she's saying that transportation, where she is an issue as far as not only the parents being able to provide that transportation to get the children to the service, but there aren't any, maybe taxis that run or it's very limited where she is. How can they pay for the transportation that way? One of the sidebars was maybe an Uber to get the person here. I want to just raise this concern with Uber. Quite honestly, even taxis, if taxis or Ubers are there, because there was an issue with a child being transported by taxi to a different location that was in foster care, and something happened with that child.
mm-hmm.
Okay, and so that's why we now have a scenario where we're talking about foster care and transporting our children to foster care. DSS says no to taxis, right? That's one of the conversations that's happening. And so I say all that to say we can possibly pay for transportation, but we have to be extremely cautious with the type of transportation we are providing, because we do not want to get ourselves into a scenario where a child is taken advantage of in some way by one of these public transportation services, Uber or Lyft. Did I make the scenario any better for you? No, I did not. I'm sorry, but I always want to make sure we are thinking of all of the possibilities in what we decide to do. Because nobody wants to have our names in the newspaper as the ones who allowed our children to be victimized, even though we were trying to help. So,
Yes.
is there a possibility that you can pay someone on staff to transport that child? I don't know what your district procedures are with that. That's something that you would have to look into with your district. But that is a way that you could consider paying for providing that transportation. If you have someone who is, who's gone through all the fingerprints and, they're covered under the district, and hopefully nothing would happen and that person could transport the child to and from that particular service.
Yeah, Jewel, that's really important information and considerations. And unfortunately, it is the world that we have to consider those. On your note, the other, I don't know, it depends on individual circumstances in a district, but there is potentially the possibility of, could you add on to a school bus contract? So could you pay your school bus drivers who, and I don't want to say that your school bus drivers are, not necessarily everything's perfect with your school bus drivers, but there's a different level of insurance. There's a different level of, as Jewel was saying, of qualifications for school bus drivers. And so that might be, and maybe the bus company has smaller vehicles that they could use with the bus drivers. And so, that would be supplemental. We're going to talk about supplemental after, but that you could contract with your school bus company for additional services after school, or even during school hours if they're not being used, to drive them to the appointment. So I think that's a really good idea. Please. Sure. Right.
And so transportation from Charleston has always been an issue for us. And so, when we received ARP funds, I was able to contract with a company called Evergy. And, those employees who, work for Evergy, they're called vetted employees. And then parents can track, those drivers are tracked from one location as they transfer students from school to home. School. So they can track. So that's an option. And that's how we transport students who are in foster care and displaced.
Homeless students. Yeah, that's if something like that, and I don't know how expansive they are across the state. You know, Charleston's a little bit more of a metro community, but yeah, something like that's an option. The other option, and I both want to mention it, but also thinking there's a lot of qualifiers with it. As Jules said, one thing that we did in Wisconsin, and I don't know again, and this is more for students experiencing homelessness. If the family had access to cars, we had prepaid gas cards, and there are cards that can only be used for gasoline so that families could transport students. But again, there are challenge with that. There are risks associated with that. In some cases, especially in rural communities, like you were saying, there weren't many other options, and it was the only way the student to get to school on time. And there are cards that can only be used for gas, so you can't go into the convenience store and buy other things with them. But it's still, there are risks associated with that, and it's a challenging environment. And so sometimes those have to be balanced, and kind of going all the way back to the prudent person, there's not just one way to look at it in terms of a prudent person. Transportation, many of these federal programs, often a challenge. Anything else as we wrap up this section? Anything else on allowable costs, necessary and reasonable? All right, we're going to take a 5-minute break then, and come back with maintenance of effort and supplement, not supplant afterwards, but a 5-minute break. So we will come back at 10:10. How far we've come to Charleston. Yep. Drivers, they say, hey,
Yeah, I'm also. So what's in there? Y'all are good.
All right.
All right, y'all, thank you. All right, well, thank you.
I didn't get a motion. I was gonna say, do this, there's so much. My sentence, first change.
Yes.
Hey there. All right, we're going to go ahead and get started and want to give a appreciation to Jennifer, who just wanted to let everybody know they've asked to adjust the temperature. Not sure that it's reasonable in here right now, and so necessary. A couple degrees warmer maybe might be both reasonable and necessary. But I think, you know, I'm from Wisconsin, and so we don't, all of our venues don't have air conditioning. It's actually one of the things I was saying. We're having a heat wave this week and 90+ degree temperatures in the state, and we only have a handful of schools statewide that have air conditioning because there's just usually not that much. So we even had schools that had to close early yesterday because the internal temperatures were, you know, 90+, 100 degrees. Actually, some of our buildings, if you even think about it, it's Wisconsin, so some of the buildings are built to capture heat and to stay warm in the winter to reduce heating costs. So then you get a 95-degree day, and it's pretty miserable for those little ones. So actually, our largest city, Milwaukee, closed all of their schools, I think 2 hours early yesterday. So a big change there. We will adjust the temperature, and then, as it always happens, by lunchtime it'll be too warm in here, and then we'll go back, and but we'll figure it out. So Jennifer, thank you very much for doing that. All right, gonna spend the next time leading into an activity with allowable costs, but we're gonna spend a little bit of time talking about the fiscal requirements of maintenance of effort and supplement not supplant. These are, you know, I have them framed here as Title I fiscal requirements. Actually, as I'm looking at this slide, I should have framed them as ESEA fiscal requirements. For those of you who work with ESEA programs, supplement not supplant and maintenance of effort are both ESEA fiscal requirements, and they're in relation, and they're important. There's also some key differences, especially with supplement not supplant, which I will go into. I was a Title I Part A director and have a lot of more detailed information, spent more time on supplement not supplant than I care to, but certainly glad to discuss that. So I'll also point out where there are some differences in supplement not supplant for the different ESEA programs. But I want to start with maintenance of effort, which is covered both in Title I, Section 118A, but also in Section 8521. And Title 8 of the ESEA is the general provision, so they apply to all of the programs. And this is important for maintenance of effort in that maintenance of effort means that a local education agency must maintain its effort, continue at 90% or more of the previous year's funding on a year-to-year basis. And why maintenance of effort is important is that if an LEA does not meet maintenance of effort programs, it's not unique to Title I Part D, but if an LEA does not meet maintenance of effort, then all of their federal programs, Title I Part A, Title I Part, not all of their federal programs, virtually all, Title I Part A, Title I Part D, Title II Part A, Title III Part A, Title IV Part B, Title V, they have to be reduced by the amount that you're spending less on. The purpose of maintenance of effort, I think sometimes the details can be a little bit, you can get too far into the weeds in the details. I actually like to think of maintenance of effort as what is the intent of this clause in the federal law? The federal government is saying, look, if you remember back to yesterday, education is a state and local responsibility. So the federal government will provide some additional funding to your districts, but this additional funding is not meant to replace your local funding. And so one of the ways that we're going to do that is we're going to make sure that year to year you are maintaining your effort at generally at least 90% of the previous year. It is tested annually, and if you fall below that 90%, we're going to reduce your federal funds on all of those programs as a way of, it's a disincentivizing you or incentivizing you to keep up your local funds, disincentivizing you to take away your local funds. Now, there are some cases, and I don't know exactly how South Carolina Department of Ed is organized. There are some cases where districts fall below maintenance of effort for unforeseen circumstances, and the State Department has the ability to waive maintenance of effort, or the U.S. Department of Ed does, or I think actually the State Department applies to the U.S. Department of Ed to waive maintenance of effort in certain cases. Those are rare cases, but sometimes things happen. Obviously, in recent memory, the biggest thing that happened in maintenance of effort was when COVID hit. The U.S. Department of Education put out blanket waivers. The law still existed, so they had to put out blanket waivers. I imagine all of your districts filled out. It was a checkbox that your superintendent or school board president had to sign, and then the state applied for waivers on their behalf. As far as I know, every school district in the country did this because costs from year to year just dropped because buildings were closed. And you think about that, well, teachers might have still been paid and other things. That is true, but facility costs went down. Even things like heating and air conditioning costs went down when those buildings were not heated and air conditioned, and transportation costs went down. And so maintenance of effort was below 90%. And so when there are those types of disasters, that's another thing that happens in South Carolina. I know we're at the beginning of the school year and coincides with hurricane season. When hurricanes hit, that sometimes can impact maintenance of effort. Flooding can do it. So there are certain circumstances where if districts have to close buildings for 3 weeks, 4 weeks, it can impact maintenance of effort. There are then applications that districts can take and get waivers for this. But if the school board just decides, you know what, we have all this actually was a big thing that came in with ESSER funds, is the federal government also included maintenance of effort with ESSER funds because they did not want districts to say, hey, we've got these, small districts, hundreds of thousands of dollars, large districts, millions, tens of millions of dollars coming in. We'll just reduce our local spending and use the ESSER funds instead. And the federal government said, no, this has to be supplemental for some specific purposes related to the pandemic. And so the penalty for maintenance of effort is that if you fall below, if you are out of compliance, there is a reduction in allocation for all ESEA covered programs. And sometimes that reduction in allocation even includes into the following year, and the maintenance of effort that you have to establish for succeeding years is back to what 90% of when you last met it was. It gets pretty convoluted with maintenance of effort. So, but this is one, and sometimes in your role, this is one sometimes you have to remind your superintendent or even school board when they say, with ESSER, I know I fielded a lot of calls asking for help because ESA coordinator would say, hey, my school board just wants to cut our local spending. Okay, here's why you should not do that. Here's why it's not going to actually help you as much as you think it's going to help you. And sometimes you get put in that position of having to explain that to folks of why that is the case. So I think maintenance of effort, it's fairly straightforward. This is something else, is that it's much more than just a program responsibility. And I know, your role as the program officer is not you're not in charge of your local budget. You don't do that. That's superintendent, school board responsibility, however it's outlined in your district. But you need to pay attention to it. And this is one to definitely collaborate with your business office, your other federal programs. IDEA also has a maintenance of effort requirement. It's slightly different, and I'm not as familiar with IDEA maintenance of effort, but you can, if you're out of compliance for maintenance of effort, again, it can cost your district more than anything that someone in your district thinks you're going to save. So you want to think about that. And if there is a unique circumstance, call your South Carolina Department of Education folks and figure that out on the front end or as early as you can in the process to know what to do and how to alleviate that so you can get a maintenance of effort waiver. In some ways, maintenance of effort is straightforward in that you need to have that 90%, but then the details do get convoluted. But I don't know if there's any, this might not be, but any questions or discussion about maintenance of effort? I will also say it is not a common thing because business managers, the business manager side, they are very familiar with this. And so it is uncommon to have violations of maintenance of effort. And if it happens, usually proactively, you can work with the district. Like I said, the times it's most frequent is if there's been a natural disaster or something happened and there were major situation that folks are aware of, and then go through the paperwork to alleviate maintenance of effort issues. So maintenance of effort is the quicker one of these two. The longer one is about supplement, not supplant, and need to spend a little bit of time on supplement, not supplant. I'm actually curious. I'm going to do a quick poll here on a fist to 5 on how you would rate your knowledge and experience with supplement, not supplant. 0 being never even heard of it before, 5 again being an expert. Where would you say your range of knowledge on supplement, not supplant would be? All right, great. I'm seeing some 3s, 4s, 5s. That's great. This is a knowledgeable crowd. That I'm glad to hear that. And so hopefully, I'll maybe, if you're at that 5 range, we don't maybe not spend as much time on this as needed, but also hopefully you'll hear things today that will reassure you and think, oh yeah, that's how I'm doing it. I'm feeling good about this. I'm in a good place. So a lot of times people get caught up in the details of supplement, not supplant, especially, and I'm going to do that too. So I'm going to call myself out for it in the details and the details of how you demonstrate compliance with supplement, not supplant. And those details are important. But I also think the general rule is important. And one of the ways I think that you help fulfill the details is by knowing what the general rule is and then aligning with the general rule. So the general rule says a state educational agency or local educational agency shall use federal funds received only to supplement the funds that would, in the absence of such federal funds, be made available from state and local sources for the education of students participating in programs, and not to supplant such funds. So basically, the federal funds need to be on top of your local funds. And if you keep that in mind as your local rule of on top of your local funds, then you're going to be a lot of the way there in terms of meeting your compliance requirements. So I think sometimes, again, get focused on the details, but keep this in mind as a general rule. Like I said, got to be used to add on to existing programs, not to replace. All right. One thing, and I thought I had a slide in here, but I don't. Title I supplement, not supplant under ESSA. This language is exactly the same as in No Child Left Behind. This language did not change at all. There's a lot of conversation. If you're the Title I Part A director, you know that there were significant changes to supplement, not supplant. I think sometimes we focus a little bit too much on the changes and not on the same things. This language is identical to No Child Left Behind. What changed was the compliance test under Title I Part A. And the compliance test under Title I Part A had to do with a demonstrated methodology that showed that you are not violating supplement, not supplant. And no longer did you have to demonstrate that individual cost expenditures were supplemental and were not supplanting. That change was made only for Title I Part A. USDE clarified this in guidance that for Title I's Part C and D, also for Title II, Title III, the other programs that have supplement, not supplant requirements, the old No Child Left Behind rules still apply. And so there are still the tests, if you were in your role under No Child Left Behind, tests that you used to apply to Title I Part A that you no longer have to do apply to Title I Part D, both Subpart 1 and Subpart 2. So those tests include something called the presumption of supplanting. And this is from USDE guidance. It goes back to 2006 guidance. But if you look at the recent fiscal guidance, it says that specifically that for Title I Part D, the old rules apply. So this 2006 guidance is still in place. Again, in your head, you need to keep Title I Part A separate from Title I Part D, and I will do my best with that. I'll be honest, sometimes it gets a little bit convoluted, or you transpose things and say, wait, do I have to do this? You have to do it this way in Title I Part D, this way in Title I Part A. But I'm going to give you a couple of examples here, and we're going to do a little bit of an activity with them, because in the following instances, it is presumed that supplanting has occurred. Keep in mind that any determination about supplanting is case specific, and so it's hard to know exactly what we're looking at here. But these presumption doesn't mean automatically that you're in violation. It's just that if we see these things, if South Carolina Department of Ed sees these things in application, they are going to ask additional questions of you to determine if supplanting has occurred. So what I put up here, these examples, and again, these are from the non-regulatory guidance, this is not automatic that supplanting has occurred, but this is, if you see something like this, it's something that would raise that red flag for Title I Part D. Again, this is different from Title I Part A. And so we're going to go through these actually. We're going to do a little bit, got time here. We're going to do these activities here. We're going to look at these activities and think, are there some activities that might be flagged as a presumption of supplanting, and how could we demonstrate that that would not be the case how could we demonstrate that these would not be the case because we could not have provided these services if we didn't have Title I Part D funds. So hope that might be a little bit confusing, but let's go through these and see if we can get there. So can I get a volunteer to read number 1, presumption of supplanting, please? Thank you very much. So what's an example of something that's required under your state or local law? Actually, I reveal my ignorance of South Carolina. I don't know if you have, different states do it differently. Do you have minimum days of instruction or minutes of instruction in your state, required minimum? I don't know whether it's days or minutes of instruction. We in Wisconsin switched from days to minutes, but we have a required number of minutes in Wisconsin that you have to meet. So if you are using Title I Part D funds to meet those minutes of instruction, are you then, for all students using Title I Part D funds, would that do you see how that could potentially be supplanting? That would be a presumption of supplanting there. Think, okay, you can't do that because it's required under Part D. That, you know, I don't know that if you have any specific requirements for students, there is some, well, actually, I'm going to hold off on that example because it gets a little bit convoluted. But if they are required services, then it's a presumption of supplanting and you want to avoid those types of things. Let's do number 2 here for a second. Somebody volunteer to read number 2? And now this is one which comes up frequently. It's you had, I want to actually talk with this one for a second about how you can demonstrate this one. If you had a program in the previous year, let's say a tutoring program, and you paid for it with local funds, and then in the following year, you say, okay, we're going to put in our Title I Part D application a tutoring program, and South Carolina, and in your application, you write, we're going to pay for this tutoring program because it's been really successful. It's been impactful. Here's the data that we have on this program that shows that these kids are more likely to stay in school, to graduate from high school. It's a really good program. South Carolina reviewer looks at it and says, well, this is great. It seems like an impactful program, but I didn't see it in your application last year. Oh yeah, we paid for it with local funds last year. Right away, that's the presumption of supplanting. Now, again, presumption of supplanting. If you're in the district, what would be a way that you could, how could you overcome that presumption of supplanting? Thank you. Absolutely perfect. A board decision to reduce funds for after-school program. And we have this, I don't know exactly how South Carolina Department of Education does it. We'd say, board decisions are, I love board decisions because they're documented, they're legal documents, and you have a board clerk who records those. Could you attach that to your application showing that you have a board decision that reduced those funds? Yep, here it is. Okay, now it becomes likely, and again, you don't know those examples, but that's a very likely example of now what you've taken an unallowable cost and turned it into an allowable cost, but you have a board decision that said, we are not going to pay for this anymore, and therefore this cost can now be allowable and can overcome the presumption of supplanting. It's a great example. Thank you very much. Somebody read number 3.
In a Title I Part D program that the LEA provided with non-federal funds to children not participating in Title I Part D.
And this is one that we get, and I would say, this is one, I'm not gonna speak for any of you in your positions, but sometimes this is what happens. Hey, we want to take the junior class on a college tour. It's going to be an expensive trip. We're trying to cobble together funds. So we have some of our local funds, but you've got that Title I Part D. We've got 10 of the 100 students are under Title I Part D. How about we use Title I Part D funds to cover those, and we'll use those 10 students, and we'll use our local funds to cover the 90 non-Title I funds. That right there, and sometimes administrators, superintendents, you know, hopefully you've done a good job educating them, but you need to share with them. That's kind of the example of, no, that is almost the textbook definition of supplanting, that if there are local funds to be made available for the non-Title I students, then you need to use local funds for those Title I students. Now, you can take the same scenario and there might be something on top of it. This is, actually, I'm going to switch the scenario because I can't quite think of the college tour, but here's an example. Let's go back to the tutoring program example. We have a tutoring program that runs from 3 p.m. to 4 p.m. to all students. We pay for it with our local funds for all of our students. Again, we have 10 Title I Part D students. Can we use Title I Part D students to pay for their portion of the 3 o'clock to 4 o'clock tutoring program, or would that be supplanting? That would be supplanting. What if you said, okay, but our Title I Part D students are even in more need than our regular students. We're going to extend that tutoring program just for Title I Part D students from 4 p.m. to 5 p.m. So everybody's invited from 3 to 4. We're then going to have our Title I Part D students from 4 to 5. Would that be allowable? And use Title I Part D funds for the 4 to 5 hour to pay for the teacher for that. And I'm seeing heads nod. And so I think people are real familiar with this, is that you can see how those examples are used on top of, and think about that. If it is extra, if those Title I students, Title I Part D students are getting something extra, you're spending your regular amount of your state and local funds, but you're providing extra on top of them, then you have removed the presumption of supplanting. Yes. Well, that's a really good question, and it might have to do with our the question that I would ask if I was reviewing that, are non-Title I Part D students also getting after-school tutoring that's making up their seat time, and is it being paid with local funds? And core curriculum gets tricky because, especially if you're in a Title I Part A school-wide program, you can use funds for core curriculum teachers, so it gets a little bit tricky. But again, with that makeup time or credit recovery time, I would ask, what if you have non-Title I students or non-Title I Part D students, do they have services that are being provided? If they're being provided a teacher the opportunity to do that with state and local funds, then it would be a supplanting issue, because you're doing the same thing, state and local funds for non-title students and title funds for title students. That's a potential supplanting. Does that make sense?
Would it ever be allowable?
Well, I think two answers to that. Yeah, and I sort of want to get myself into this and welcome anybody else. I'm sort of processing through it, but it's a really good question. So I think two ways. Number one, if the district is not offering seat time makeup, I see what you're saying, that it's still a responsibility, but they're saying this is an opportunity for students. It's kind of like a tutoring, like more of an opportunity to get to the core curriculum. But then if it's the hours of local instruction to meet those requires of hours of, right, am I talking myself into a circle in this case? Yes. So then that becomes core curricular. So essentially, are you replacing the core curricular?
Sometimes we do fund that out of federal funds. So I'm just curious.
I think because of that second part of it, is it was offered to all of the students, and now this is additional support for those students who are in the federal program who didn't have it. And so for that reason, I think that time would be allowable. I don't know if my friends from SCDE have any thoughts on that, but I think that's because of that, is you offered it to everybody, and and now you're saying, okay, these are students and they've been identified as at risk. They need a little bit more support even in making up those hours, and this is not available to all of the students, and so it would be allowable in that type of situation. But I had to think. Thank you so much for that question. That was a really good one. I had to think about that one, and hopefully didn't talk myself into a pickle in that one. Because yes, again, with the caveat that if you're offering it to non-title students, then that might be an additional danger. But if you're not offering it to non-title students, then it is extra. So it would be supplemental. Any other questions or comments about supplanting and the presumption of supplanting? Okay, one other element of supplanting and supplement, not supplant, that is that both adds clarity and confusion almost simultaneously is something which is referred to as the exclusion rule. And so it says, when determining, and I'm thinking, did the exclusion rule potentially play into this as well? When determining whether Title I Part D funding is supplemental, an SEA or LEA may exclude state and local funds expended in any school for carrying out a program that meets the intent and purposes of Title I Part D. And what that means is if you're spending local funds on students who've been identified as neglected and delinquent, those funds don't count as local funds. You can count those as Title I Part D funds, and you would not necessarily be supplanting. So I didn't write down a good one on this, but let me try with this type of example. If you have some type of, your school board has said, look, we want to make sure, we want to increase our high school graduation rate among students who are identified federally as neglected or delinquent students. And so we're going to do a local credit recovery program just for students who are identified as NND. And so it's a local program funded locally, but that's all that it's for. And then towards the end of the year, they run short on that money and say, can you use federal funds now? We need an additional, to carry through the last 2 months of the school year. Can we, can we use our federal funds for that? In this case, your supplanting would not be an issue because the state and local program is for the same purposes as the federal program. It's not available to all students. It was just targeting your Title I Part D students, and so it would be allowable. The exclusion rule, you can get really confused. I've wound myself in circles. I administered a state program which was for reading of third graders, and then it got really, we basically made a determination that all of the funds in this state program, because it was for reading for third graders, qualified under Title I Part A funds, and we just excluded them because it was also administratively easier to do that way. But the exclusion rule is a good thing, and you can use it to your advantage if you have a local program that is especially supporting students identified as, in this case, neglected and delinquent. You also can see this sometimes with students experiencing homelessness, but something to keep in mind, but it also can add some confusion. So I'm glad to have some discussion. I didn't want to totally confuse folks, but it's an important one to also keep in mind. Trying to think if that credit recovery program might also cover under the exclusion program, in that, if you're saying that this is for the purposes of carrying it, because one of the intent and purposes of carrying out Title I Part D is keep them on the path to graduation. And so you could say that it also might cover under the exclusion rule. Again, I'd have to think about that a little bit, but that might be there in that example. Any questions about supplement, not supplant? Hopefully I've clarified and not made it too confusing. Or even anybody, any concerns about Title I Part D supplement, not supplant versus Title I Part A supplement, not supplant, and the difference there? Again, I'm not doing a training on the Title I Part A supplement, not supplant, but how the methodology differences from this. So these specifics here, again, just to be really clear, these specifics they no longer apply to Title I Part A funds. You don't have to demonstrate this. You just have to demonstrate that the school received its full share of state and local funds. And you have to have a methodology that shows that. But if that school received its full share of state and local funds, then you don't have to worry about any individual program under Title I Part A. You do have to worry about it under Title I Part D, under Title I Part C, under Title II Part A, 3 Part A, and so forth. Be interesting if Congress decides to sort of standardize that in the next iteration whenever they reauthorize, just to make it a little bit less of a headache. All right, we're going to move into an allowable use of funds activity, and you have 4 tools that are going to help you with this. And I want to I'm going to share these tools. Actually, I'm going to kind of walk you through this, and I'll look at our time so that we're going to do this. And yep, I'll need to just adjust my time a little bit, and we're doing fine. So this is an activity with allowable use of funds. NDTAC has produced a tool, which I think is really valuable, helpful, called Steps to Approve Proposed Uses of Funds. And it goes through a lot of the questions that we asked here today. I think I had it open, but I'm going to open it just, it's a Word doc. So you have access to this. And again, you have access to this as a Word document. Expand it, make it a little bit larger here. As you can see here, this tool includes 6 steps users can take to determine whether a proposed use of funds is allowable and appropriate. And so you can see here, and it has this document has it broken down into subpart 1 and subpart 2. And so you have, I'll just give a quick example here first with subpart 1. Again, you don't necessarily have to fill this out, but for each, if you have a proposed use of funds that you're thinking about, kind of like some of these transportation questions that we had before, you put that there in the proposed use of funds, and then it walks you through these questions. Step 1, do the proposed uses comply with federal requirements regarding the use of Title I Part D subpart 1 funds? And you have the use of funds, the institution-wide projects, transition services, the non-regulatory guidance. These have links in it. We have covered virtually all of these links as you go through here. Step 2, do the proposed uses align with the goals and objectives of the state plan? You also have the state plan in your materials. Do the proposed uses align with the requirements for and the needs expressed in the application? So what was your needs assessment? What did that show? Gives you your yes, no there. Do they comply with other applicable federal regulations? And now what we covered this morning, all of these different federal regulations, and do they comply with applicable state and local laws and regulations? So this is a great checklist to help you evaluate your proposed use of funds. Hey, I'm thinking about this. Is this going to be allowable? And you can go through these, and you're sitting at tables, so you can actually work with partners on this. And then starting on page 4, they have virtually the same questions, but a separate section of the document for subpart 2, which is, I know, most of us. But you can see, again, the questions are the same. They just give a little bit of a difference here, including starting with, which I appreciate NDTAC did this, starting with section 1421, the purpose of subpart 2. So again, alignment in there, and you can see this, and it gives you the opportunity to do yes, no, and an explanation or notes. This is the same type of process that South Carolina Department of Education is going to go through as they're working through their questions, and they're going to ask these as questions. And so this document is something, again, it's a Word document, so you can actually type it and work through it and work with partners on this. Extremely helpful. There's one more document which I want to show you, which is NDTAC also has a tip sheet titled The Use of Funds Decision Process. And this was published. This is published in August of 2023. Been working with Ann. They published another tip sheet. I don't have a good contact at NDTAC. Just they have another tip sheet called Tip Sheet Use of Funds Decision Making. September 2023. It's a different document, and why they have these two things that are so close together and yet slightly different. I'm not sure why they did that, but this is a supplemental document, but it might help you in that it gives just 4 decision points, which again can help you. You might even use this before you go to the worksheet, the Word document, because it just gives you 4 decision points. Number 1, does the cost align with the purpose of the authorizing statute? Number 2, is the proposed use of funds allowable under Title I Part D? Number 3, is the proposed cost reasonable and necessary? Number 4, does the proposed cost align with the allocability requirements in the federal regulations? And so it gives you, again, those kind of precise 4 decision points that you can get there, and you can work through those decision points and do your use of funds and answer these questions. So this document can help you with the other one. And then also, just so that you know you have it, you have both the Title I Part D handbook, page 5, and the allowable use of funds guidance, page 11, give you some of those examples from Title I Part D for allowable uses of funds. So we are going to take, adjusting the time a little bit, we're going to take until 11:30. So you have about 35 minutes here or so. We're going to take until 11:30 to have you work individually or in your small group on these allowable uses of funds and evaluate something either that you've done in the past, something that you're considering for this year, and go through that document and see, is this something that I can use my Title I Part D funds to do? You could probably adjust it for other titles as well, but you see those questions are kind of specific for Title I Part D. Any questions about the activity? And then we'll come back 11:30 to wrap up before we break for lunch. And I'll be circulating and glad to also play those if you have questions of, hey, I'm thinking about this, where does this fall? I'll be glad to help with that.